Have you ever looked around and thought, why does it feel like the world economy is breaking? Inflation spiraling out of control, crushing debt, political chaos, widening inequality, rising global tensions. It's not just random. This is all part of a much bigger pattern, a cycle that plays out again and again throughout history. It's led to cataclysmic events like the Great Depression, World Wars I and II, and if you go back far enough, even the fall of the Dutch Empire in the 1600s. This pattern is called the long-term debt cycle, and understanding it might be the key to making sense of everything happening around us right now. So what exactly is the long-term debt cycle? Most people think of the economy in short bursts, those familiar 5 to 10-year cycles of boom, bust, recession, and recovery. You've probably lived through a few of these yourself. But let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture. There's actually a much larger pattern at play, one that unfolds over 75 to 100 years, essentially a full human lifetime. This is the long-term debt cycle, and as the name suggests, it all revolves around debt. Here's how it works. First, a country starts with relatively low debt and strong economic growth. The government borrows money to invest in things that matter: infrastructure, education, healthcare, military defense. The debt begins to rise, but it's manageable and purposeful. Second, over time, people, businesses, and governments all start borrowing more and more. More borrowing fuels more spending, which drives more growth. Everything feels great. The country seems to be getting richer and more prosperous. Living standards improve, opportunities expand, optimism abounds. But underneath it all, the debt keeps growing, silently accumulating like water behind a dam. Third, and this is where things get dangerous, eventually the debt becomes too big. The government has to not only pay back what it borrowed, but also service the massive interest payments on that debt. This is when the central bank typically steps in and starts printing money to help pay off these obligations. But there's a catch. Printing more money leads to currency devaluation. When you flood the system with new money, the money everyone already has becomes less valuable. This triggers inflation, and suddenly your paycheck doesn't stretch as far as it used to. This is the stage where cracks start appearing in the foundation of the entire economic system. Unfortunately, the United States, Europe, and many other developed nations are now deep into the final stages of this debt supercycle. The numbers are staggering and almost impossible to comprehend. The US is currently sitting on $36.7 trillion in debt, and the interest payments alone cost about $3 billion per day. Think about that. $3 billion every single day just to service the debt, not even to pay it down. The UK government is drowning in £2.7 trillion of debt. These aren't just statistics. They represent a fundamental weakness in the economic foundation of some of the world's most powerful nations. But the debt problem is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Right now, the global economy is being hammered by 3 massive forces all hitting at once, creating a perfect storm of economic instability. The first force is the combination of high debt and money printing. We've already talked about this, but it bears repeating because it's so critical. Too much borrowing combined with too much money flooding into the system equals inflation and deep instability. When governments can't pay their bills through normal revenues, they resort to printing money, which is essentially a hidden tax on everyone who holds that currency. Your savings lose value, your purchasing power erodes, and the very foundation of economic trust begins to crumble. The second force is internal conflict, and this one's particularly insidious. As people and companies borrow more money, much of that capital flows into assets like stocks, real estate, and businesses. This causes asset prices to surge upward. Sounds good, right? Here's the problem. Wealthy people own most of these assets, while middle and lower income people primarily earn their income through wages. So when asset prices boom, the rich get exponentially richer while everyone else essentially stays flat or falls behind. A person who owns multiple properties and a diversified stock portfolio sees their wealth multiply, while someone working a regular job just sees their rent go up and the dream of homeownership slip further away. This growing wealth gap leads directly to the rise of populism and political extremism. When the divide between rich and poor gets too wide, people lose trust in the system. They feel the game is rigged, that no matter how hard they work, they'll never get ahead. Does this sound familiar? Look at what's happening in the United States, France, or the United Kingdom right now. The political landscape is fracturing along these exact lines. The data shows this same pattern has emerged again and again before major economic and political collapses throughout history. It's like watching the same movie play out in different eras. The third force is external conflict, and this one might be the most dangerous of all. As one global power declines, another inevitably rises to challenge it. That's exactly what's happening now between the United States and China. This phenomenon is known as the changing world order, and it's been a constant throughout human civilization. History shows that roughly every 250 years, the dominant empire, whether it was the Dutch, the British, or now the Americans, loses power while a new challenger emerges. When the established power becomes weak enough and the rising power becomes strong enough, the newcomer starts actively challenging for the position of dominance. We're now entering one of these pivotal periods of great power conflict, with China rising to challenge America's position as the world's superpower. If you want to explore this topic in much greater detail, I highly recommend reading Ray Dalio's book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. It's absolutely fascinating stuff, written by the founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's largest and most successful hedge funds. Ray has spent years studying these historical patterns, analyzing data going back centuries, and his research forms the foundation for much of what we're discussing here. His insights help make sense of what might otherwise seem like chaotic, random events. If you purchase the book through the link in the description, we'll earn a small commission, which is a great way to support the channel if you're finding this content valuable. So let's dive deeper into how these empires actually rise and fall. Dalio analyzed over 500 years of economic and political history, examining the trajectories of the world's great powers. What he discovered was a remarkably consistent pattern in how empires rise to dominance and then eventually decline and fall. Every great empire starts the same way, with massive investment in human capital. They build high-quality education systems that are the envy of the world. They cultivate a strong work ethic throughout the population. There's a cultural emphasis on discipline, productivity, and delayed gratification. People are willing to sacrifice today for a better tomorrow. This foundation of educated, hardworking, disciplined people leads to an explosion of creativity, innovation, and problem-solving capability. The nation develops a genuine competitive edge that other countries simply can't match. Look at the historical examples. In the 1600s, the Dutch dominated through superior shipping technology and financial innovation. They literally ruled the waves and controlled global trade routes. In the 1800s, Britain industrialized faster and more completely than anyone else, becoming the workshop of the world. In the 1900s, the United States surged ahead with mass production techniques, groundbreaking scientific research, and a higher education system that attracted the world's best minds. As this wave of innovation takes off, productivity increases dramatically and the economy grows rapidly. The country becomes a leader in global trade. Businesses expand internationally. Profits rise and get reinvested. This wealth then feeds back into military strength, better infrastructure, and expanding global influence. It's a virtuous cycle where success breeds more success. At this point, the rising power becomes so economically and politically dominant that the rest of the world begins to trust its currency for international trade and as a store of value. This is when something truly special happens. The nation's currency becomes the global reserve currency, just as the US dollar is today. This status is an enormous advantage that most people don't fully appreciate. When the world wants and needs your currency, other countries actively buy your government's bonds to hold as safe investments. This creates massive demand for your debt. Because this demand is so high and so reliable, you don't need to offer high interest rates to attract buyers. You can borrow money far more cheaply than any other nation. The empire can run substantial budget deficits without triggering a financial crisis, and its financial system becomes the undisputed center of the global economy. This is the peak of imperial power. However, and this is crucial, this golden phase also plants the seeds of future problems. As the empire becomes wealthier and more comfortable, subtle but significant shifts begin to occur. The government and its citizens start taking on more and more debt, confident that the good times will continue forever. The population grows accustomed to a high standard of living and, frankly, becomes lazier and more complacent. The hunger and drive that built the empire begins to fade. Citizens increasingly expect generous government benefits, protections, and subsidies regardless of whether they've earned them. Political debates shift from how do we grow the economic pie and create more opportunity, to how do we divide up the existing pie. People begin to feel entitled to jobs, housing, and healthcare simply by virtue of being citizens, regardless of their actual productivity or contribution. At the same time, military overreach becomes common. The empire extends itself too far, getting involved in costly foreign entanglements that drain resources without providing corresponding benefits. Meanwhile, the wealth that's been created isn't shared evenly throughout society. The rich get dramatically richer through their ownership of appreciating assets, while the poor and middle class fall further and further behind. Social tensions begin to simmer, then boil over. Eventually, the combination of rising debt and deepening political division becomes completely unsustainable. Governments borrow and print money frantically to cover their deficits and maintain social stability. Inflation rises, eroding people's purchasing power and savings. Trust in institutions and leaders declines sharply. Nobody believes the official statistics or the promises from politicians anymore. The society becomes bitterly polarized, with people retreating to ideological extremes. Protests erupt. Instability becomes the new normal. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the world, a rival power has been quietly rising in the background, steadily gaining strength economically, militarily, and technologically. They've been watching, learning, and building. The final blow to the declining empire comes when it loses its reserve currency status, and with it, much of its global influence and economic privilege. The currency falls in value, inflation accelerates dramatically, and the country can no longer afford to project global power the way it once did. At this point, the cycle ends for one empire and begins anew for another, often following the exact same pattern the previous empire did centuries earlier. It's like watching history rhyme. According to Ray Dalio's extensive analysis, the United States is currently in the late, dangerous stages of this historical cycle. Look at the warning signs: record-high national debt that grows every single year, deep and worsening political polarization that makes basic governance nearly impossible, rapidly falling trust in nearly all major institutions from government to media to academia, growing economic inequality that's creating two Americas living side by side, and increasing social unrest bubbling just beneath the surface. The US dollar is still the world's dominant reserve currency, but it's facing serious and growing pressure from multiple directions. Meanwhile, China is methodically following the early steps of the same cycle that once made the United States so powerful and dominant. They're investing absolutely massive amounts in education, producing millions of engineers and scientists every year. They're building world-class infrastructure at a pace that makes other nations look sluggish. They're pouring resources into innovation and emerging technologies like AI, quantum computing, and green energy. They're building extensive global trade networks through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's ambitious global infrastructure and investment project aimed at building trade routes and boosting economic ties across Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond. They're steadily expanding their military reach and developing alternative financial systems that could one day challenge or replace the dollar-based order. Dalio's research warns that we may be entering a period of major global realignment, with economic and political power preparing to shift dramatically from west to east. This isn't conspiracy theory or fear-mongering, it's pattern recognition based on centuries of historical data. So what does all this mean for us, for ordinary people just trying to live our lives, raise our families, and build some financial security? Here's the key message, and it's actually not as bleak as you might think. The world isn't ending. It's transitioning into a new kind of order. The economy isn't simply collapsing into oblivion. It's being fundamentally reset. That transformation could mean we'll see a new financial system emerge, perhaps one not dominated by the US dollar. It could mean a significant shift in global power dynamics, with different countries calling the shots. It will likely bring major changes in how we work, how we save, how we invest, and how we think about economic security. The question we all need to ask ourselves is, are we ready for what's coming next? Are we educating ourselves about these shifts? Are we diversifying our skills and our investments? Are we building resilience into our financial lives? Or are we just assuming that tomorrow will look like today, only to be caught completely off guard when the transition accelerates? Understanding these long-term cycles doesn't give us a crystal ball, but it does give us perspective. It helps us see that what feels like chaos and decline might actually be the birth pangs of something new. Empires have risen and fallen throughout human history, and life has gone on. Those who understood the patterns and positioned themselves accordingly often emerged stronger on the other side. Those who denied reality and clung to the old order typically suffered. The choice is ours. We can bury our heads in the sand and hope everything works out, or we can face these realities head-on, educate ourselves, adapt our strategies, and prepare for a world that's going to look quite different from the one we grew up in. History is happening right now, and we have front-row seats. The question is whether we'll be passive observers or active participants in shaping what comes next.